this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget.
Today I'm having a conversation with Craig LeMasters. Craig is the former CEO of a $5 billion Fortune 500 subsidiary, an entrepreneur, speaker, investor, and board member. Currently, he's the CEO of GXG, an advisory firm that helps organizations de-risk and accelerate growth initiatives by connecting them with the right combination of external knowledge and experience. He's also the author of a new book, Unstuck, How to Unlock and Activate the Wisdom of Others. Craig, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Clint. Love the work you're doing, and I love your theme around conversation. So what a privilege it is to be with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I also appreciate that I attended both schools you mentioned in the book, Duke and Georgia Tech. So thanks for that.
All right. That's awesome.
So you tell the story of your time at Assurance Solutions throughout the book. Can you give a quick sketch of the issues you were facing?
Yeah. So, and you know, I spent my whole work life there until I started GXG 4 years ago, Clint. So it really is my professional life, 27 years with the same organization, which is a little unusual. But what I found as I moved up and through the organization is, and I use the term stuck and unstuck a lot, but I tended to get stuck on really hard problems throughout my career, if you would, at Assurant. And that's how I sort of landed on this methodology that I'm so passionate about. But a lot of the challenges had the same theme, even though they were very different. And the theme was typically I was going from what I would call core, what I sort of knew how to do, to new stuff. It's not a fancy word, but, you know, we call it adjacencies or new markets or products. But for me, it's just new stuff. When we try to go from our core to new stuff, we tend to get stuck because it's pretty hard. But that's the thematic challenge I had. As I grew up in the company, got bigger roles, the stuck topics got more complicated. And when I bumped into this methodology and started to work on it, was some of the bigger themes were around digital transformation, was probably the biggest one that I faced in my whole work life. And some of our global expansion, particularly the Far East, getting into China and some of the markets there was really, really hard for me. And that's when I knew I had to do something different. And that's when I sort of started fooling around with this Unstuck methodology, which is my vocation now.
Well, we'll talk more about the expansion a little bit later on. I do have some questions around that.
Sure.
You start the book off with an equation, which as an engineer, of course, I love. The equation is wisdom equals knowledge multiplied by experience.
Yeah.
Why is that formula so important?
Well, I call this wisdom-based learning because I became obsessed with this idea. Back to things I was stuck on. It's like, why did I get stuck on this particular topic and not other things? Like I said, thematically, that's when I landed on it. It tended to be when I was doing the new things. And then that started, I broke that down. I'm actually pretty analytical as well. Even though I don't have an engineering degree, I love to think about things from an analytical perspective. So as I broke that down, that's when I landed on this, wow, I just don't feel like I have the wisdom to go do the new stuff. And there's lots of definitions for wisdom out there. The one I landed on was this unique intersection between both knowledge and experience. And the reason I like it so much, if you think about both of those, is when they collide, is when I think we have real wisdom that is useful in doing the new things. And more importantly, what I was able to do is literally go back and sort of reverse engineer my problems and say, wow, I was usually missing one or the other or potentially both. But when I had both, I tended to move at an incredible speed. You know, we like to call it agile leadership. But that when I really had the wisdom, or my team had the wisdom, that's when we got stuff done. And in my vernacular, we got unstuck. So that's why I started with the definition, because it really is the root of all the work we do now. Is if you buy into that definition and you interject it and you put it in the middle of what we're stuck on, that's the secret sauce.
Now, you say that we're all probably stuck on something right now, whether we know it or not. How do you define being stuck? What does that really mean?
Yeah, it's a fun term. Hopefully, it's a little provocative, and I get some funny looks sometimes when I meet, particularly with C-suite, executives. We start talking about our body of work, and I'm like, "Hey, what are you stuck on?" And some people actually get offended by it, which I think is kind of funny. It's like, wow, let's just be honest. We do get stuck. What I mean by it is we're just not moving fast enough. I mean, stuck is not that. What it's not is that we're not trying. We usually are trying very hard. It's not that we're not smart. It's not that we don't care. There's a long list of what it's not, but what it is we're just not getting there fast enough. I mean, we're both live in the South, so people get the picture of, I always use the term stuck in the mud. Like you picture the pickup truck that's barely moving through the mud. They're still moving forward. It's just not very fast. And as a leader, having run a big company, this is a real problem. And here's why, because that slow movement we misinterpret as real progress. And so I started calling it this thing called the circle of stuck, because we fool ourselves that we're making real progress. And the reality is we really are stuck, and we've got to do something different. That's how I define it.
I love the circle of stuck graphic in the book, by the way. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that is?
Yeah, I just sort of had some fun with it, because I kept getting this question like, what does stuck mean? How do I know if I'm stuck? And there's lots of ways to know if you're stuck, but I started fooling around with it one day. Actually, I love drawing pictures. And so I was at a client and I started drawing on their whiteboard, which I love to do. And so let me just draw you a picture of what had happened to me. And I don't know if it applies to you. And then I started using it in talks, and it resonated with people. So the circle of stuck kind of goes like this, where when we're trying to do something new, we all start at the same place, or at least I usually survey people, and that's we have a meeting. And there's nothing wrong with a meeting. Don't get me wrong. We have to have meetings, but we start with a meeting. And after the meeting, we tend to do the same thing, which is we summarize the meeting, and then we send an email to a bunch of people, right? Here's what we covered in the meeting. And maybe we have some action steps and next steps. But what tends to happen is some people get offended because they weren't copied on it. So the email list and the blind carbon copy list gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So now we have this big group of people. Some people weren't at the meeting, so then they want to have another meeting, right? So we say, hey, I wasn't in that meeting, so let's have another meeting. So we have another meeting. You can see it starts to repeat itself. But then what we add to it typically, because we're not really making progress, again, we're kind of stuck here. We're not making progress. So then we may interject some design thinking or some elaborate, stick 'em game where we put up new ideas. Nothing wrong with all of that. But again, we summarize it, and then we have another meeting. And then we interject one of my favorites, which I call buzzword salad, where what we perfected at my company, I knew we were stuck when we would start to create a whole new vocabulary around what we were working on, acronyms and new words, and everybody felt good about it because we had all this vocabulary, literally. But guess what, Clint? We still weren't moving forward. And then we would pay the big money to bring in high-powered consultants, and paying consultants, millions of dollars to come in. And guess where we would end up? Usually, and I find it interesting as I talk about this, circle of stuck usually lasts about 1 year, which is kind of sad in one sense. Mine lasted sometimes longer, but about the 1 year mark, you know what we do? We throw up our hands and we decide to go in a room with a bigger group and have another meeting. And we literally start the cycle over again. And again, I just told it as my story, and all of a sudden people started nodding their heads. And I had several CEOs actually say, have you been like sitting in our company, right? And one of the symptoms in there that I left out, that's one of the sure tail signs. And again, I don't have data to back this up, but I've got a lot of anecdotes that do, which is this bizarre thing we do of carbon copying CCs on emails. So I started telling the story that really bothered me, and I eliminated CCs because it felt like a security blanket that we were making progress because, I have 30 people on the CC. I had a CEO interrupt me one time and said, you know what? I just broke that record. And I'm like, I don't know, what are you talking about? He said, I just saw an email. I never thought about it till you said this, but I just saw an email this morning, had 374 CCs on it. Wow. Think about that for a second. The guy was kind of devastated. He goes, I never thought about that as like we were stuck. I think it was like a badge of accomplishment. I'm like, well, you might want to rethink it. But anyway, that's the circle of stuck. It's just a fun way to sort of diagnose yourself, your company, your organization. I don't care how big or small you are. But if you're doing any of that circular behavior, you're probably stuck and you need some help with that.
Yeah, you're a visual person, and I love some of the visuals in the book. So a story you tell in the book that really resonated with me was the company that had 50 priority initiatives they were supposedly working on. How does that even happen?
Yeah, it's funny, and I have, and again, I have a probably a little bit odd sense of humor, so forgive me, Clint. But I think leaders get very creative. I did anyway on stuff like this, right? Because we were big on prioritization, and what I found was that we would, and I'm big on the number three. You only had three things you work on, but what we really had was three: A, B, C, D, E, and F. And all these like are one A, B, C, D, and F, two A, B, C. And so what you find is you add it up and you end up having 50. Some don't even try to hide it. I mean, the story I use in the book, I mean, literally a company, we started working with them, and I'm a fanatic about point A to point B and just simplicity and all this. And they're like, great, we're already there. And you pop it up there and you start adding it up, and it's like, how are you going to do 50 things? I don't care how big your company is. I don't care how smart the people are. Who can do 50 things well? Right. But yeah, I know you see it in your practice as well. I mean, it's almost comical. And right. But it starts there. We have to have the humility to say, this is not the way to get unstuck, or at least the way we think about it.
Yeah, you're right. When I teach classes, I'll often ask the people in the room, how many of you work on more than one project at a time, to which they almost all respond affirmatively. Yeah. And then I say, okay, of all the projects you currently have on your plate, how many are you told are top priority? And of course, everybody laughs because they all are. But then my point is, if they're all top priority, none of them are. They're all the same priority.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sad. And I would argue right now, this is a more important topic than ever. Not to digress, but if we throw the pandemic on top of this, and I have lots of conversations with C-suiters every day on this very point, which is, I think this is what's creating stress for people right now. Yeah, there's a pandemic and there's all kinds of challenges, and we have racial challenges and political challenges. But as leaders, the lack of prioritization right now is crushing people. And I believe the only definition of leadership that matters is we get paid to make choices, and we better get much better right now at making choices and stop that nonsense. Give people a couple of real priorities, you pick them and then cascade them. And I think that's what's driving the stress, Clint. Right now, it's so easy on Zoom, 7x24. You know what most leaders are doing? We're just piling on more stuff. And it's gotten worse, not better. And then we wonder, why is everybody so stressed? And let's have a virtual happy hour to make everybody feel better. That's not what that's not going to work. It doesn't work. What's going to work is you go and tell them we're only going to focus on two things, really. Right. So it's a great opportunity for leaders, but I think it's a systemic problem.
Why do you think that is, though? I'm curious as well, because to me, it's always surprised me that people wouldn't just make a decision about what's the most important 1, 2, or 3 things and let's go do it. And they take the shotgun approach of everything. Let's do everything.
Yeah, it's just less risky. I mean, I think as individuals, just as human beings, we were fairly risk averse. Okay. Right. And so I think it's just super less. It was for me. I mean, I felt better if I said, hey, everybody go work on 10 things. And if they don't work, then, maybe one of them works and, I'll look better. But boy, it is riskier to say, hey, I'm going to gather the information and I'm going to make a choice. We're going to bet on 2. And I can tell you, I had the incredible good fortune of being CEO of a big company for 11 years. Most people don't do it that long or make it that long, or whatever. And I did it. And part of it, why I had some really wise people that taught me this over time. It's like, look, the better you get at making choices and slimming down those choices and priorities, the better the organization will do and the more you'll enjoy your job. That's simple, right? And it was hard at first because it felt super risky, but you know what? Got a lot better at it. I think. And I think that's why I did it for a long time.
I think another thing that people lose sight of is just because you decide to go after number 2 doesn't mean that you don't quickly realize it's not going to work and pivot. Bingo. And do something different. I mean, so rather than try to do 10 things, let's try to do one really well. And if that's not the right thing to do, then we'll pick something else.
Oh, I love that, Clint. And one of my favorite passions, and we teach it a lot, is the topic around culture. I get asked a lot about culture, and I believe in grit. If you go study Angela Duckworth's work on grit, I've been working on it for 15 years, use it in everything I do. And this is one of the primary topics. If you believe in grit, this passion and perseverance, it's the strongest correlator of, I think, success across the board. One of the things that gets misrepresented there, though, is, well, it just means you just keep banging your head up against the wall no matter how hard. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It actually means exactly what you just said. I'm going to go really hard at number 1. And guess what? If that's not the right door, I'm going to go just as hard at the next door. And we will find the door that opens, right? But I got to tell you, trying to go find 5 doors at the same time with equal effort, you know what? We end up being sort of mediocre at a bunch of stuff. And that doesn't work today. Mediocre at a bunch of stuff is just not going to work.
Now I'm reminded of the cartoon from The Far Side where the school is titled Midvale School for the Gifted, and there's a guy pushing like heck on the door, and it says pull, and he's never going to get it to work. Right?
I love that. Love that.
Now, a couple terms you spent a bit of time on in part 1 of your book are operators and wisdom. You've already done a good job of defining wisdom, but what do you mean by operators?
Yeah. So my whole work is around the idea that the wisdom most of us need to get unstuck lies in operators. And to me, operators are people like you and me that have just worked in organizations. We've worked on hard topics, and over a period of time, and it doesn't have to be forever. It's not what wisdom means, but over a period of time, we've accumulated knowledge and experience in very specific swim lanes, right? And again, this is a misconception out there on wisdom. When I talk about wisdom, it's usually in a very specific swim lane. Most of us are not gifted in wisdom in a bunch of stuff. I've got 1 or 2 swim lanes that I think I have been gifted in. I have a lot of knowledge and experience in that I'm really good at. You're the same. I mean, I look at the work that you do in your swim lane, and you guys have knowledge and experience as operators like nobody else. And so that's why I'm really fixated. And I contrast operator from academic, right, and consultant, right? And I love academics. I love consultants. I've used them both extensively. But for my body of work, and I think solving the really hard stuff as leaders, there is nothing comes close to the effectiveness of an operator with wisdom that can share that wisdom in a simple facilitated format to get me unstuck. So that's why I spend time on it. And those are the 2 pieces of secret sauce that I really looking for is operators with the wisdom, very specific wisdom to help a very, very specific stuck topic.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Don Miller and StoryBrand, but he uses that terminology. He uses guide. And so basically a guide is somebody who's been in your shoes before. He's not the hero of the story. You are, but he's there or she's there to guide you through the events.
Absolutely. And I love that description of it, Clint, because that's really all this is. I don't try to overblow this concept because it's not complicated. It's basically finding people that have gone before us and done something that we happen to be stuck on, not because we're bad people, but because we haven't done it before. It's okay. It's okay if you don't have the knowledge and experience. Somebody does. And here's the beautiful thing is people like to share that wisdom. If you ask them in the right way, they're happy to share it. Happy to.
Yeah, people are proud of their swim lane, right?
I think so. I mean, we get asked all the time because we've been scaling pretty good the last few years. Like, well, how do you keep finding all those people? I said, quite frankly, we don't have to look for most of the wisdom. It's finding us now because people do sort of our work and they love sharing their wisdom. We do it in a highly facilitated format that makes it easy for people. And they want to do it more, but more importantly, they go tell their friends and family, you should do this. It's a great experience. I made a new relationship. And guess what? I learned as much as they did. I mean, I talk about that a little bit in the book. The spirit of reciprocity is alive and well. I mean, you get somebody to share wisdom in the right way with you, and then they realize how much they got back from the conversation, right? Because all of ours are conversations. This is not PowerPoint deck time. These are conversations. And that spirit of reciprocity is alive and well and just kind of blossoms. So our network has just grown organically, exponentially the last couple of years because people want to help.
Well, we've always been kind of a small boutique organization. We've been around for almost 40 years, but people often ask, well, why aren't you bigger? And so the joke is, it's actually a true statement, but the joke is we only hire engineers with social skills willing to travel 3 weeks a month on the road. Good luck with that.
Yeah, good luck.
I think we found them all.
You got them, but that's your swim lane. What I love about what you do is you've taken a topic and really morphed it into something very special because of the wisdom that you went and found and curated and perfected, and it moves the needles of your clients. The output you get is exponentially better than on their own because of that wisdom. I mean, it's actually a great example of what we try to do across, and again, hundreds of different topics.
Well, you mentioned consultants a minute ago, so I think you'll appreciate
Yeah.
the story. I was working for a company in Minneapolis early in my career, and the project manager was on the phone, and he called me into his office, and he was finishing up his conversation, and he was talking smack about consultants and basically calling us everything but a child of God. And when he hung up, I said, "Dick, I'm right here, man." He goes, "You don't," he says, "You're not a consultant. You actually add value."
I love that. I love that. And I, sometimes I have some fun with this when I'm doing talks, but I love to tell some consulting stories from my past. But, and I think particularly as public companies, it gets challenging because the traditional consulting firms have done a great job of selling their work to board of directors, and it's important, and it is very confirming on a lot of things. But I get really personal, and just like you do in your work, ours is about working with leaders that are looking for real practical hands-on, like I call it, operator help to go from point A to point B, right? So it is actually a very different body of work. So I really am not, let me go on the record here, I'm not anti-consulting. Most of my friends are in the big firms and some of them are running them. So I love that work, but ours is a little different.
Sure. So what role does humility play as a determinant of success in the wisdom formula?
Yeah, it's the starting point. I mean, we have a simple sort of process that we share in the book of how we do this work, and it's a starting point. I think that humility is a topic we don't like to talk about. I think most leaders get all, kind of uncomfortable, or some do, talking about it, but it has to start there. And if you think about the nature of the work, where we're going to ask wise people to come into the organization and help you solve a really hard problem, by definition, you got to have some humility. And quite frankly, the first piece of work we typically do, we call it pressure testing, where we just want to, because most people have plans and they have ideas on what they're doing. And we bring in some really wise people and we pressure test the plans. We assume that it's a good plan, it's going to work, and then we just bring in wise people to pressure test. That takes a lot of humility. And I think it gets overlooked in organizations, Clint. And I think we hang on too long to what we think we know. And sometimes the last thing I would say on this is not usually intentional. I like to think that we do it sort of accidentally. And here's why. I think when we have success, and again, I'm talking about myself, the whole book and our whole practice about the stuff that I did wrong, and hopefully we're helping on. But when we were really good at growing, and I assumed if I was really good at growing an organization, which we did, when we did the really new stuff, for me, I mentioned it earlier, digital transformation in China was one of those areas. Why is it I got stuck on those? Right. And so the lack of humility that me and my team had was because we had done other hard things, we assumed that we had the knowledge and experience to go do this new stuff. And we just didn't. My aha was, and I think we were talking about, I think it was on digital transformation. I finally looked at my team because we were struggling for 2 years. We're wasting money. We're buying stuff and all kinds of wacky things, but it's just not working. I finally asked my team, I'm looking at like 8 of us and going, hey, what is our IQ on this topic? I hadn't come up with the whole wisdom formula, but today, in my words now, it's like, what's our knowledge and experience? And we were about a 2 or a 3 on a scale of 10. On an honest assessment. And I'm like, this is pretty cool. The future of the company is in this room. We're building it. We're buying stuff. And we have about a 3 on a 10 of wisdom. And again, as I've told that story over the last 4 years, we got a lot of affirmation. It's like, hey, you've been watching us. That's what we do. And again, it's not because we're bad people. We're trying, but let's just be humble enough to say we're a 3 out of a 10. When we put the 9 and the 10s and the 8s in the room, we built an entirely new digital company in about 8 months. And that's all. I mean, that's the difference.
Now, in the book,
it's got to start with humility. Yeah,
for sure. Now, speaking of humility, in the book, you did mention that it's a word that has a lot of definitions, and some of them are not very flattering. So how do you define humility?
Yeah, I think, and again, tons of way to define it, but the ones that I like, or the one that I like the most is, are you willing to not just accept, but really to embrace outside thinking, right? This outside wisdom, this outside knowledge and experience. Are you really willing to embrace it? And again, there's tons of great definitions. I cite something there, but that's the question that it always boils down to me. And we don't do any engagements until the leader that's hiring us is convincing to us that, yeah, we're ready for that. It might be hard. We might push back some, but we know we need it. And we have enough humility to dive in. So that's what I lean back on.
You also say in the book that we need to avoid the strategy trap. What is that?
The strategy trap is one of my favorite topics, and it gets back to my consulting friends. I think that because there's such an amazing industry out there that has convinced us that there is a perfect strategy, and my hypothesis is there's not. But there's good news. There's actually a bunch of really, really good strategies. So the strategy trap for me is just simply don't get in the circle of stuck, which we do on strategy, where we just go round and round. And I have a simple solution for that. Here's a real technical, simple solution or complicated solution, which is just pick one. If you and your team have narrowed it down, you got 2 or 3 pathways, because I've seen this over and over in my own company and now with hundreds of companies the last 4 years. Most likely those top 2 or 3 are all going to work at some level. Can we please move to execution? But that's the trap part of it is, and I get it because it's fun, Clint. I mean, it's really fun. Who doesn't enjoy the research, the debate, the nuance, and all this kind of kabuki dance we do around strategy? But boy, it's not a good service to the organization if we can't ever pick one and really be committed to it. So that's the trap. Pick one.
Yeah, I know I talk about it a lot as analysis paralysis. And there's this desire to make the perfect decision. In reality, I think the saying is perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Good enough, yeah. And I see it in strategy the most. I mean, it's amazing. And yet the funny thing is, to me, or maybe it's a sad thing, is everything we're looking at is based on hypothesis anyway. Right. And who better decide? If you believe you have the right wisdom in the room to make the decision, then pull the trigger, make the decision, pick one.
Absolutely. Yeah. You make extensive use of mind maps in your work, and I was wondering, what are they and how are they helpful?
Yeah, so we love the mapping game, and we call them learning ecosystems. So the primary use is really to decide, once we've decided the destination, that's the pick the strategy. So if you want to go from point A to point B, and I always like to use simple examples, which is if I make coffee cups and I decide I want to be in the water bottle business. Okay, so if the water bottle is in the middle of the ecosystem or the mind map, right? Then what we really force, it's a forcing mechanism to say, okay, of all the things that need to happen to make water bottles now, what are the 2 or 3 circles or bubbles, right, on that ecosystem that are imperatives when it comes to knowledge and experience? So what do we have to make a great water bottle, right? And that sounds really simple, Clint. You would be fascinated by if we videotape the conversations we have with really good companies and the debate that creates, right? There's like 30 things. Well, no, there can only be 2 or 3. But we do that because we really force people to think about what matters in making that great new thing or building that new distribution or whatever the destination is. But that becomes the core of our work, because you know what those bubbles usually represent is a wisdom gap. And the reason we know that is once we get the bubbles done, and let's say it's digital transformation, because that's a hot topic and where I sort of met this whole methodology. And so we were the first ecosystem in this business model. And when I was running Assurant, and we actually mapped it. And what we found was, and there were 3 or 4 that we were just very low on wisdom, but the one of them was data, right? We didn't know how to capture data. We didn't know how to use it. We didn't know how to monetize it, all these different sub bubbles. But what I started doing is let's just play a quick probability game. And it's so much fun to do this with clients. I would encourage all your listeners to do it. Just put in the middle, what's your destination, map this out, pick the 2 or 3 things you got to be really wise on, and then just do an honest probability. What is the probability of my success in that example on data with the wisdom I have in the company today? And you go around and you score it really quickly. And I've been doing this nonstop for 4 years. The average score on these new topics is less than 60% when you add it all up. And it usually kind of shocks people, because back to the humility thing, it's like, hey, we got this, we can go do this. And they don't really know what I'm doing on the probability game because there's all these component parts. And it's so much fun, because then you look at leaders and say, okay, well, here's the score. Here's what we're saying is somebody's got to walk down the hall and tell the boss that this thing that we promised we're going to do, that's probably the most important thing in the company, we've got about a 58% chance of getting her done, right? Any volunteers to go have that conversation? It's pretty funny, right? And I promise you, some of these are really big companies. I mean, brands you would know, just like you deal with, and they sit there and then they want to change the game, right? Then they want to change the scores and say, I didn't mean that. I'm like, no, you did mean it. But that's the humility piece, is that, okay, because here's the good news. We can go find the wisdom to solve that. But that's why we use the mind maps, the ecosystem concept, just a great visual. And we do the same thing with individual leaders, because we use the same concept to help individual leaders learn. It's our version of kind of a tired methodology around executive coaching, I believe. So we use this for our coaching platform. If I put you in the middle, and you're the successor or you're in a new role, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would just discreetly like to have a lot of wisdom on that you can't really raise your hand and say, hey, I don't know much about that. I'm the new CFO and I don't really know how the balance sheet works. Now, hopefully that's an extreme example, but you'd be surprised at what some people say. And then we just go find the wisdom to help them. So the visual is really, really important to us.
Well, that wraps up part 1 of my conversation with Craig LeMasters, the CEO of advisory firm GXG and author of Unstuck, How to Unlock and Activate the Wisdom of Others. Coming up in part 2, we'll discuss why it's important to really get to know your colleagues, not just their kids' ages and spouses' names, but their heart.
But I would argue that in most organizations, no matter the side, we know more about people we work with than we actually know them. Okay. And what I mean by that is we typically don't take the time. And when I think about knowing somebody, I want to know more about their heart. And that's a word we don't like to use in companies. Right. It's like, I don't know if it's not politically correct, but what I mean by that is, how do they think about things? How do they process information? How do they make decisions?
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton and Paget. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at Amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.